following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Few Philadelphia sports fans know that the most successful professional franchise in the history of our city is the old Athletics, managed by the legendary Connie Mack. That is, at least those of you who didn't listen last week when we were talking about the greatest baseball teams of all time. But just to remind you, between 1902 and 1954, when they played their last game in the city of brotherly love, the A's won 5 world championships and 9 American League pennants. That is a record that still has yet to be broken by any of the city's other professional sports franchises. The A's were at their best in the late 1920s and early 1930s when such greats as Lefty Grove, Jimmy Fox, Mickey Cochran, and Ty Cobb starred for them. These were also the years of the Great Depression, when many people were out of work and youngsters found whatever jobs they could to support their families. Jennifer Robin Barr, a Philadelphia area writer, takes us back to that bittersweet time period in her historical novel, Goodbye, Mr. Spalding. Her target audience is middle school-aged readers, but as I can attest, the novel also appeals to baseball fans of all ages. Welcome to the podcast, Jennifer. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Your previous books were how-to style guidebooks. You wrote and published the Complete Idiot's Guide to Bridal Showers in 1999 and the Everything Scrapbooking book in 2002. Why the interest in writing a historical novel?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I get this question a lot because the two genres are so different, except, of course, for the research piece, which I think is big for both of them. But I started writing about 20 years ago, and I was trying to kind of find my own style of writing and dabbling in a lot of different things. At the time, I wrote a couple of articles and these how-to style guidebooks in the Complete Idiot's Guide type of genre. And I just realized that it wasn't quite right for me. I wasn't loving it. I do work full-time, and so when you're writing nights and weekends, you really want to be writing something that you absolutely love. And so I wanted to write for children, and so I joined the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, which is commonly known as SCBWI, and I started kind of dabbling in that, writing picture books and short stories, and then I found a great critique group of other writers who kind of helped me along the way, and I've been writing for children ever since. So it's been a long road, but Goodbye, Mr. Spalding is my first novel, and I'm so excited about it. I will say, though, that those experiences of those two books is something that I probably wouldn't want to give up at all because they were a great introduction to the publishing industry, and it really kind of goes to show you the power of your network because as it has it, my first acquisitions editor, who is the person who bought my first book, which was The Complete Idiot's Guide to Bridal Showers, she actually founded her own literary agency. And then 20 years later, I joined her literary agency under one of her agents. So without that first experience, I probably wouldn't be here today.
Wow, that is very fortunate. I mean, it is very difficult to find agents out there, and of course, agents have to come to
right.
you. You can't just go and hire their services. The other thing that is so fortuitous about your writing is that in terms of sports books, baseball has a monopoly pretty much on that industry. And at a time when book publication is in decline, the only aspect of book publishing that is enjoying an increase is juvenile literature. So you've married the two, and
that's wonderful.
That's a great combination. Listen, I understand that your very first baseball memory came at the age of 8, and it was watching Tug McGraw of the Philadelphia Phillies strike out Willie Wilson of the Kansas City Royals to capture the Phillies' very first World Championship in 1980. By that time, the A's had been gone from Philadelphia for more than a quarter of a century, and they were playing in Oakland. How did you learn about them?
Yeah, and it's funny you bring up that memory because I may have earlier memories, but that is the one that I can actually put a date on. And since I was only 8, I always say that's my first memory. I have a lot of really wonderful memories from the vet, but I was watching that whole scene in my den on our old cabinet floor TV, one of those TVs that was a big piece of furniture as well. And so it's such a special memory. I don't know that I can pinpoint when I first learned that Philadelphia had 2 baseball teams and about the Athletics. I feel like I always kind of knew it. We were a sports, a big Philly sports family. And I definitely remember reading articles or hearing debates about maybe which team was better, the 1929 Athletics or the 1927 Yankees. And so I'm not 100% sure I can pinpoint when I first learned about the Athletics from my childhood, but I can tell you that the first time I really learned about the A's in detail was reading Bruce Kulick's book, To Everything a Season. And it was in 2009 that I actually bought that book for my father-in-law, and I actually read it before I even gave it to him. And I loved everything I read about it. And that's when I really, really learned about the heart of the A's and everything that it meant to the city, that they meant to the city.
Of course, Bruce Kulick's book for listeners is To Everything a Season, and it is about Shibe Park and the life cycle of Shibe Park, the old Connie Mack Stadium, which is, as you say, really an excellent book and a historical record for those of us who write about Philadelphia baseball. It's interesting about your transition from the Phillies back to the old A's. I have a similar experience in that after the 1993 season, the Phillies crawled back into the cellar and were not heard from again until the early 2000s. And I was so disgusted with the quality of Phillies baseball that kind of out of, being somewhat of a wiseacre and also teaching at the William Penn Charter School, which is a huge baseball school at that period of time, I decided to follow a team that was worth following. So what I did is I went down to the Philadelphia Public Library and at Logan Circle, and I got on the microfilm, and I had made copies the front sports page of every single day of the 1929 season. And every day I would treat myself, of course the days would correspond, to what the A's did on that day, but in 1994. And I would come into class and say, oh, these A's, they're really something else. I think they really have a future. And I'd talk about Fox and I'd talk about Grove and all these people. And the kids just loved it. And it was a way of educating them about this team that, frankly, could have been the New York Yankees if Connie Mack had only given up the reins of leadership after 1931. So that was a real joy for me, and it was out of that process that my first book on the A's, Connie Mack's 29 Triumph, had grown. So, I had a similar experience of, the introduction from the Phillies to the A's. Your novel, however, is really a coming-of-age story about 2 youngsters, 12-year-old Jimmy Frank and his best friend Lola Sheridan, who live across the street from Shibe Park, where the old Philadelphia A's played. Now, their adventures revolve around the impending building of a large fence in right field to block the view of the baseball fans from North 20th Street, who built these wildcat rooftop bleachers so they could sell tickets to watch the A's play. And it was a pretty profitable scam, too, when the A's made it to the World Series in 1929, 30, and 31. Was this so-called spite fence and the rooftop bleachers your historical inspiration for writing the book?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, it actually goes back to Bruce Kulick's book, To Everything a Season. It was when I was reading that book, and it was the first time I had come across, I had heard of Connie Mack Stadium. I didn't really know much about Shibe Park, or it had been known as Shibe Park before that. And it was such a nugget of history that I was so surprised I didn't know about. And so when I started reading a little bit more about it beyond Bruce's book, a lot of what I was reading really was from an adult perspective, what it was legally, what it meant for kind of the bigger picture for the athletics and maybe the larger community. But I was kind of thinking, what was it like for those kids who could wake up every single day and look out their third floor window at a baseball stadium with a major league team playing in it? Could you imagine that today, living across the street from, and waking up and watching the Phillies, or going up to your rooftop and there are constructed bleachers and sitting on there? So I really was thinking just how devastated it must have been for those kids, and also really not quite understanding the adult reasons behind it. And so that's really where it all bubbled up from, was that little nugget of history of the spite fence.
There's so much about your book that I do want to get into, and a lot of it is your ability to put the reader in that world, that culture that is now gone, of these two, 12-year-old kids who are running around the North Penn ward of Shibe Park, and the players are accessible. I mean, they can run into them.
Right.
And as you said, and I love the way you put that, because that is the thing that kept on crossing my mind as I was reading the book. Man, what would it be like to be 8, 9, 10, 11 years old and live across the street from a ballpark and wake up every morning, particularly in the spring, the summer, and even in the fall when the A's were really good, and know that there's a ball game there, and that I have access to it. It reminded me, I was born in 1959, so I suffered through 1960 and the last years of Shibe Park, but I was really into it in the 1970s, and I kept on bugging my father, who lived in Northeast Philadelphia. I kept on bugging my father to sell our house in Northeast Philly and get a row house in South Philadelphia so I could have that experience, And
right.
that really, it was something that I could relate with, in the book, and was really immediate. And I do want to get much more into that, but I do have to ask you, the Connie Mack's effort to block, and Connie Mack, the manager and the part owner of the team, to block this view and frankly cut into the profits of the North 20th Street residents by raising the right field fence. There's part of me as I read the book that really sympathizes with those residents. In fact, as we know, Mack, after the 1934 season, did raise the right field fence from its original height of 12 feet to 38 feet by adding 26 feet of corrugated metal. And obviously, the residents of North 20th Street were outraged, and they called it the spite fence. But who was really in the right here? Mack or the residents who really counted on that money from those ticket sales to supplement their meager incomes during the Great Depression?
Yeah, and I think it could even be a healthy debate today. I think we could probably go back and forth a little bit. My head tells me that the ballpark owners, the Shibes and Mack, they had every right. It was their property, and that's ultimately because there were lawsuits, and basically it came down to that you could do whatever you want on your own property. And I get that, but my heart really understands where the homeowners were coming from. Some of them bought homes based on the vantage point. There was a culture in the neighborhoods, and they loved the team because of the accessibility, as you said it. So I think that while the ballpark owners were within their right, I just don't think they really thought about the long-term effects, because once that spike fence went up, it never really was the same with the neighborhood and within the community.
Right. Well, I'm glad you said that. You could tell, your sympathies do, appear in the writing, but and I don't want to give away too much
right.
to listeners, because I want them to get the book, so I'll be a little bit more careful. But let's talk.
Well,
it is a
historical fact.
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah, it is true. Let's talk about your main characters, Jimmy Frank and Lola Sheridan. These are fictional characters, but in many ways represent the prototypical youngsters who lived in the Shibe Park neighborhood in the 1930s. And one thing that I'm really happy that you did is, instead of doing the old boys school of always boys getting the nod in these kinds of stories, you have a girl, and girls were every bit as interested in this team if their fathers were interested in the team, and in some cases mothers as well. Tell us about these two. What kinds of kids are they? What is their relationship like with their parents, with the A's? Of course, I know all this stuff, but you tell us as much as you're comfortable telling us, okay?
Sure. I mean, bottom line is that they're really good kids. Lola is based a little bit on a few different personalities, just because you brought her up. I loved baseball growing up, and so it was really important to me to show that side, and girls love baseball just as much as boys. So this definitely is a book for everybody. But they were good kids. I think what I really wanted to show is that even as they were good kids, that they had such a level of freedom, and that was just the way it was in the time. They would leave in the morning and come home for dinner, and with that freedom comes possible things that could go wrong. And so as much as they are good kids, they still did things that probably weren't all that good, like sneaking into Shibe Park, or like doing some of the pranks that they were doing. And so that's something that I definitely wanted to show. But I also wanted to show good family life, because that's one thing that when I was talking to people, is that the families who lived on the street, and who really, the ones who moved there as families, they really had a great family dynamic. So I wanted to show that relationship. I also wanted to show just how hardworking the parents were. And while I didn't want it to dominate the book, it was the Depression. And so I wanted to show how hardworking they were, and how the kids respected that. And so even when things get really tough, and Jimmy's dad has to close the hardware store for a little bit, it's not like he just closes it, and he actually closes it so he can do other work. And so I really wanted to show the level of work ethic there, how everybody had to chip in the end, and that was really important to me, to show that dynamic within the family. As far as the relationship with the A's, you mentioned already the accessibility. I think, it's interesting, because these two characters were like any other kids who could walk down the street and see players at the barbershop or at the diner. Some of them lived in the community, and a couple of them even rented rooms on the street at different times while the A's were there. And so I think, they're like any other kids, where some of the A's players were probably, such idols or heroes to them, but then they might walk down the street and see them. And so how great would that be? So anyway, bottom line, I wanted to show them as good kids that could dabble in a little bit of trouble and see what comes of that.
Now tell us about the Polinsky brothers. I mean, they actually kind of became favorite bullies of mine. I mean, they are the archetypal bullies. Tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah. Well, when I talk to people who lived, about that age, about that time, in the era, one of the common themes was always that there was this there were always these bullies kind of kids in the neighborhood. So I really wanted to make sure there was real conflict within the neighborhood and the kids, because they weren't on their phones, they weren't in front of TVs, and so they were out all the time. And I think showing them as brothers was just something that I wanted to do, because I thought it would be a really fun dynamic, instead of having just random kids as a gang walking around. So showing them as brothers, and also how they might not have had the best home life, and I wanted to show that dynamic as well. But the one thing that I will say about the Polinskis, and this happens towards the very end of my revisions, and was a suggestion from my editor, is there's one theme and one character arc from one of the brothers that ends up being, a little bit more of a redeeming arc. And I think once I put it in there at her suggestion, I think it was a really important part of the story because it showed that there wasn't a destiny with these brothers, that they could have taken a different path. And so that was something I was really happy with the way it came out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Again, this book is so rich on so many levels, and another thing that I really like what you've done is, without being preachy, throughout the novel, you give us kind of life's little lessons, rules that Jimmy and Lola operate on. They call them, in fact, life's little rules, and I believe there are 26 of them, including my favorite, which is walls don't block us from the things that really matter. I mean, that is such a great rule, and there's such there's such truth in all these rules. Aside from the fact that the lives of the children back in the 1930s appear to have been regulated by rules, the rules appear to offer an effective vehicle to measure the maturity, the personal growth of Jimmy and Lola as the story proceeds. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, definitely. The story is definitely a coming-of-age story, and that growth is depicted in the rules. And, the first 10 rules are actually rules that are within the story, rules that are cut out of a magazine and hung in the home. And Jimmy and Lola kind of refer to them as the boring rules. And then as the story goes on, the rules that they make up are the rules that are more particular to Jimmy and Lola. And yes, as they go on, and from Rule 24, 25, and 26, they're definitely more thoughtful. I won't go into what Rule 24 is, but even though it sounds kind of funny when it's, based on the scene that it is, in the end, the rule is about what that scene was all about, and the thought behind it with the lasagna scene. And so, so they definitely get more thoughtful. But I think what I also liked was about those rules is that in the end, those first 10 rules that they originally thought were boring are the ones that they keep referring back to because they're a little bit more of those kind of purposeful rules. So, so the rules, yeah, I love that part of the book, and I played with that as I was writing it. I originally had them as chapter headings, and in the end, we decided to do it a different way, and I'm so happy with the way they turned out.
Now, while that fictional level is going on, we have a whole other level of the book, which is non-fictional, and we meet some of the real-life personalities, like Jimmy Fox, the A's power-hitting first baseman, who Jimmy and Lola try to enlist to stop Mack from raising the right field wall. There's also Richardson Dilworth, Mack's lawyer, who will, in the late 1950s, become the mayor of Philadelphia. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds as if you like Fox, who, he's the inspiration for your title, Goodbye, Mr. Spalding. And you mentioned that phrase was coined by an announcer after Double X, his nickname Fox, hit a home run off of Cubs pitcher Charlie Root in the seventh inning of Game 1 of the 1929 World Series, which is true. But Dilworth is much less endearing because he supports the raising of the fence. Now, did you use those two characters to try to paint the, I don't want to say good and evil, but the realities of adulthood and how children look at adults?
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking at, when you're writing a historical novel and there's so much history that you can put in there, and in the end, some things get taken out, and those three characters, Fox, Mack, and Dilworth, definitely kept rising up to the top. They're larger than life.
Right.
And I think they're names that kids now, they don't know as much. I mean, they might see Connie Mack's statue outside of the Philly Stadium, but Fox he was at a time during Babe Ruth. And so there, when you talk about baseball players from that era, they're not first thinking of Jimmy Fox or even know of Jimmy Fox. Richardson Dilworth was a little bit of a surprise to me. I didn't know much about him. And so the fact that he was their lawyer and then he became mayor, and all that time that I grew up in Philadelphia and never really realized what Dilworth Plaza or Dilworth Park was named after. So I thought that was a really interesting character. I'm not exactly sure that he was the villain in real life that and again, I don't know that he's necessarily a villain, but he's just doing his job in Goodbye, Mr. Spalding. So, but I definitely wanted some characters that kids could then read in the back and learn about them for real and think, wow, that is so cool.
Mm-hmm. There is a saying that good nonfiction appeals to the intellect of the reader by telling a story effectively, and that good fiction appeals to the imagination of the reader by showing him or her the details of the story. Historical novels have the potential to do both of those things, of course. That is, to show and to tell. And that's what you do. In your book, readers learn about the actual history of the neighborhood around the ballpark, which was nicknamed Swampoodle by the predominantly Irish residents. There's St. Columba's Church and School, Doc Hoffman's drugstore, Rayburn Park. I felt like I was going on a tour of that neighborhood. Not only is that historically accurate, but the story is extremely compelling. I was especially taken by the way you portrayed the atmosphere of Shibe Park on game days when you write about, and I'm quoting this, the smell of red-hot sausages, steaming peanuts, and lit cigars. I remember I went to my first ball game at Connie Mack Stadium, which was the predecessor of Shibe Park, same building, same structure, in 1964. And that was one of the first things that captured my imagination, those smells. And when I read that just took me back. And then the way you describe Jimmy Fox's personality as a, quote, kind of happy-go-lucky gentleman combined with a cowboy from the West. That's exactly Fox. It's spot on. It's spot on. So you really do an impressive job of showing the readers the atmosphere, the setting, and the personalities who operate within it, as well as telling the history. How long did it take you, Jennifer, to write this book? I mean, it takes most writers years to do one of those things, and you do both.
Thank you. Yes, it took me a very long time. I started with this idea back in 2009 when I first read Bruce's book, and then I had never written a novel before, so writing this book became kind of a masterclass in how to write it, because I definitely fumbled along the way and went through several drafts. But in the end, the show don't tell, I know there's a lot of telling with history, but in the end, when you're writing fiction, you really do need to show it, like you said. And so that is probably the biggest piece of my revision, was that showing piece. And there would be notes from my critique group or in the end from my editor in the margins, and it would just say show, don't tell here. And it would be in a place where I was maybe telling the history too poignantly, and I needed to show it a little bit. And again, this book is a narrative, and it's first person through Jimmy Frank's eyes. And so that allowed me to show a lot more, because I was able to show what he was seeing, and smelling in all the senses.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really is an extremely well-written book. Now, you've published 3 books, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you got a lot on your plate. Are you a parent too?
I'm a parent, and I also work full-time at a local college. I'm a student advisor, a career advisor. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, you also have your own agent, and agents don't take people on unless they are going to make a career out of writing. So it's very clear that is your career path. So Goodbye, Mr. Spalding is not a one-shot deal. I'm certainly hoping it's not a one-shot deal.
Well, I'm hoping it's not a one-shot deal as well.
Okay, what does the future hold for your writing career then? I mean, what where do you want to grow this?
Well, I do also write picture books. I don't have any of my picture books published yet. I'm still working on them a little bit, but I'm very excited about my next middle grade novel. That is a little too early to tell about, but I can tease that it's also historical fiction set in Philadelphia. And in fact, I'm visiting a site next Friday that I hope to be the primary setting. I just kind of want to see it and see if it's right. Not really prepared to share more, except it probably won't be baseball this time around. Although I have toyed with the idea of setting a future kind of sister book to Goodbye, Mr. Spalding, to maybe the children of Jimmy and Lola and whoever their families are with the Whiz Kids. So that's something that I thought might be fun, but I haven't quite gotten there yet.
Well, that is. I hope you do it. I mean, that's really great. Really great. We've been speaking with Jennifer Robin Barr, author of Goodbye, Mr. Spalding, which will be released by Calkins Creek Press next week on March 26th. It can be purchased, because I've seen it online, at Amazon Books, and I'm hoping that I will be seeing it the local Barnes and Nobles. Have you scheduled any book signings yet?
I have. I have several, including one at Children's Book World in Haverford on Sunday, March 31st. It's actually my book launch at 1 o'clock. And then if you go to my website, which is www.jenniferrobinbarr.com, and that's Barr with 2 R's, there's a list right on the front page of my website. I have, I think, 9 or 10 upcoming events, including 2 on Independent Bookstore Day, which is April 27th. Excellent.
Hey, good luck with the book. It should do very well. And thanks for being with us, Jennifer. I really
and thank
I
you
really
for
enjoyed
having
it.
me.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm a big fan, so I appreciate
we're going to have you back, too. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.